Hello, and welcome to this iteration of the 2024 Positioning Theory Virtual Talk Series. I'm Mary McVie, coming to you from the University of Buffalo in New York. And we have just a few announcements today before we get started. And you'll have to bear with me. We haven't been able to get the announcements slides up, but we're going to go through them, and we'll also be putting some links in the chat for you. So first of all, just a reminder that we're doing these virtual talks based on the forthcoming handbook, International Handbook of Positioning Theory. And I'm sorry, I'm getting an update that I need to update my computer. I don't want it to shut down. It's been a wonderful day of technology so far. So, but Bo is co-host, so if I disappear at any point because my computer shuts off, you should be in good hands. So just a heads up, Bo. So reminders to register for the virtual series. Bo has put a link in the chat for you where you can register for future events. We're doing these monthly based on the Routledge International Handbook of Positioning Theory, which is in press, and we'll let you know when that is ready to be rolled out. And we also want to remind you that the 2024 Positioning Theory Conference is being held at the University of Eastern Finland. We have extended the date for conference proposals until March 4th, and I'm going to turn things over to Pasi Hervonen. And so Pasi, would you like to tell us a little bit about the conference?
Yeah, hi everyone, and greetings from Finland. Well, all I really had to say was actually to remind you of the extended deadline of the paper submissions, but I'm hoping to see as many of you as possible in Finland in late July next summer. I will send the link to the web pages of the conference to the chat alongside my email. So should you have some questions, please feel free to send me some email and I'm happy to answer. The registration for the conference will open on March 15th, by which time we should have, or close to that time, we should have the decisions on the paper submissions as well. And the registration closes on May 15th. Okay, I think that's about it, but great to see you guys. And I'll send you the link to the web pages and my email to the chat as well.
Great, thank you, Pasi. Well, with that, we're going to move on, and I'm going to turn things over to our first presenters today, to Carolin and Bo.
So hi, everybody. My name is Carolin Demuth, and I am Associate Professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. And I'm giving this presentation together with my colleague Bo Christensen, who is also from Aalborg University. And we both, together with Brady Wagner, who I see is in the audience. Hi, Brady. We are the co-directors of the Center for Cultural Psychology at Aalborg University. And Bo and I are going to present the book chapter that we have in the book. So I'm going to share the screen, and that should hopefully work.
Yes.
So I hand over to you, Bo.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Carolin. As Carolin said, my name is Bo, and I'm briefly, in the next slide, going to talk about this chapter 17 on positioning and preschool children and so on. I'm going to talk about the aim and the rationale for this chapter, and then Carolin will talk about her very interesting research among these preschoolers in India on which this is based. So as part of this chapter, a brief review of some of the literature within positioning theory on early childhood development and education was done. And one of the things that emerged was that a lot of this previous research into positioning in preschool or elementary educational settings had occurred mainly in the field of literacy and second language learning. So research on the very early childhood educational settings, such as preschools and kindergartens, at least of what we could find, was very scarce. So this was a somewhat unexplored territory within positioning theory, and kind of like made up the rationale of the first aim, which is applying positioning theory to the study of human development in early educational settings. On top of that, an aspect which has so far received, I think, little attention is that since activities in educational settings are permeated with cultural beliefs and ideals and values, with important implication for teachers and students also beyond the classroom, much more attention to cultural psychological issues could also be beneficial for positioning theory as well. So besides studying these very early educational settings, an interesting part, which Carolin and I thought, was also trying to combine or think about how to combine positioning theory and cultural and discursive psychology, which makes up the rationale of the second one, as considering positioning theory as related to cultural and discursive psychology. Furthermore, positioning theory, cultural psychology, and discursive psychology are similar in the sense that all are interested in the processes of how people construct meaning and identities in everyday shared social and normative settings. But the difference between cultural psychology and positioning theory probably is that cultural psychology is more explicitly connects these shared settings with historically evolved cultural practices and material structures. However, this aligns well, I think, with some of the recent developments within positioning theory by Mary and others, for example, of incorporating artifacts and embodiment as part of these positionings in general. Hence, psychological development must be understood as a process involving through the embodied discursive engagement with the material and sociocultural world. And this makes the connection with ethnomethodology very relevant, because this is one of perhaps its primary focus as well. So this kind of like presents some of the overall ideas behind the aims and the rationale behind this chapter, and all the interesting details I'm going to leave to Carolin to carry on.
Okay, thank you. So why should we look into this kind of research? Children, through learning to participate in language practices in mundane everyday interaction, also acquire a cultural worldview, and they learn to perceive of the world and of themselves in a specific cultural way. This is something that has also been addressed in the language socialization paradigm by Alan Oakes and Bamberg. And in order to understand how this is achieved, we think that positioning theory offers a valuable approach where we can see in mundane everyday interaction how are children positioned by teachers, by caregivers, and how do they position themselves, do they reject the positioning, etc. We also think, as Bo already mentioned, that methodologically informed discursive psychology and ethnomethodology are valuable tools because the recent developments in these approaches also take into account the artifactual and embodied positions and not only verbal positioning. So the data that I'm going to present is from a study that was conducted during a 3-month ethnographic fieldwork in an English-speaking preschool in northern India. This is a class with 5-year-old children, and there's one teacher with approximately 30 children in the classroom. So the analytical aim is to demonstrate ways in which moral orders are produced and reproduced in situ, and how children therefore are socialized towards specific discursive productions of selves and understanding the rights and the duties accompanying these constructions of normativity. So the analytic focus here was, I was looking at situations where the teacher seeks to have the children engage in or desist from some course of action. So these are situations where the children were held accountable for their misbehavior. And I was looking at how does the teacher produce moral evaluations of these misbehavior? How does she assign blame and culpability regarding the children's bodily misbehavior? And how do embodied practices, how they are used in tandem with discursive practices. This mainly occurred not only, but mainly in times of transitions when we had one activity finished and the teacher wanted to move on to a next activity. And usually what happens there is that the children somehow need to be kept quiet so that the teacher has the time to prepare for the next activity. So what we see here in the video that I'm going to show is they had just doing one what she called energizing exercise. The children are standing here in the class. And now the children are supposed, and they are familiar with what is coming next, they are supposed to sit down and lay their heads on the table during that transition time where the teacher now is preparing for the next activity. And we are going to see what's happening. We just found out as we were testing just before the meeting now that apparently there's a slight problem with the videos. They used to, it's one of those days, you know, where the videos work perfectly just before you give the presentation, and then 5 minutes before, when you try them again, there's a problem. So apparently the videos are not going that smoothly there, but I hope you're able to see what is happening anyway, and I will walk you through the details in the transcript. Also, if the sound is not completely perfect, I walk you through the transcript afterwards. I'm going to show the video first.
What is the meaning of the bell? Azar, Riddhi. Yuvraj, what's the meaning of the bell? Let me bring. Put your head down. Okay, let's start.
Apologies for the bad quality. But what we see here, when you look at the transcript, and we go through it now line by line, we see first that the teacher is in front of the class. And in line 2, she produces an activity shift marker, OK, followed by a directive produced with a collaborative first-person plural pronoun. OK, let's sit down. We do that together, right? Commencing the act of an activity shift within this social episode is tied to the normative order of the educational setting, and it is something only the teacher has a right to. Hence, by what she's doing that not only verbally, but also this activity shift marker is produced also in an embodied way by clapping her hands. Okay, so commencing the act of an activity shift within this social episode is tied to the normative order of the educational setting, and it is something only the teacher has the right to. Hence, by clapping her hands and ringing the bell, and we have also this material object that she's using. The teacher positions herself as having the right to give instructions and the children having the duty to follow her instructions. And this is done not only in a verbal way, but in a lamination of this verbal activity shift marker and an embodied intention seeking, the clapping of the hands and the use of a material object, the bell. By ringing the bell, also the teacher positions herself as an instructor. Now in line 7, we see first in line 6 that several children then start to sit down, but there are still a few that are sitting upright. And then she produces this utterance in line 7. Now, when I ring the bell, what does it mean? And she's walking backwards while she speaks. This is a typical IRE format that teachers use. It's very typical in classroom interaction. That means an initiation by the teacher, a reply by the student, and what's followed normally is an evaluation by the teacher. So the question is asked in that format that implies that there is a correct answer, and the teacher will then evaluate whether this answer is correct or wrong. It presupposes also, using that format, presupposes that children know the correct answer. So she's positioning the children as knowing what the expected answer is. The ringing of the bell in this in here is that she's referring to ringing this specific bell. It's not just any bell, but it's this specific bell in the context of this social episode. And thereby she is reminding the children of the normative character of previous episodes of ringing the bell in her joint history with the class. We may infer from this that she expects the children to be familiar with the interactional move that is produced by her ringing the bell, and that they have the obligation to respond to it in a specific, that is, in a correct way. Now, in line 9, one child produces an answer. The child says sitting, which is ratified by a nodding by the teacher. However, this is followed by a further prompting in line 10, which suggests that this is not the preferred answer. This is not the expected answer. Then another child 2, then produces another verbal response, heads down, in line 11. Here the teacher answers, yeah, but I don't see any heads down, with an open palm hand gesture and turning her head to the class. So the yeah indicates an agreement with the child's answer, while but performs an opposing action. The teacher's utterance, her speech act, thus has the illocutionary meaning that her question was not meant as an information-seeking question, but questioning of the children's lack of a behavioral response of what was expected of them, a compliance. Her utterance can be heard as, if you know what it means, how come you don't behave accordingly? Thereby positioning the children indirectly as knowingly misbehavior. In line 12, this is likely to be heard by the class as a complaint. Yeah, but I don't see any heads down. Since the open palm gesture works here as a question marker. And we see again, the way she positions the children is not only done verbally, but she uses embodied means, like here, the gesture of the open palm. And then she continues, except for Nikit, and pointing to the child. So by singling out one specific child here as the only one having provided the correct response, not addressing him directly, but rather as someone who is talked about, she sets up a contrastive emphasis clearly directed to the rest of the class as an audience. And we can also see her pointing as an upgrade of her verbal talk here. She continues to say, okay, ringing the bell for another 3 seconds, and then she stops in front of the table where 2 children are still sitting upright. The other children have started to lay down their bodies, but there are still 2 children who are sitting upright. And she says, hurry. Again, she uses an activity shift marker. Now here the bell serves as a directive. The teacher uses an embodied move, walking over to the table, of orienting towards the non-compliant children. So we see here a positioning of her body as an upgrade, followed by a verbal imperative. She then repeats, what is the meaning of the bell? Bhaskar, addressing a specific child, and this child, Bhaskar, lays down his head on the table. In line 21, she addresses 2 further children. She puts the bell down on the desk and walks into the classroom towards another child, Karun, who is still sitting upright. Karun, what's the meaning of the bell? And then she's pointing at Karun. She stops in front of Karun and tells him, put the hand down. So what we see here in line 19 to 24 is a repetition of this interactional move, calling individual children by their names, followed by a repetition of the teacher's initial question. In doing so, the teacher indicates that the correct response would be an embodied compliance and is still missing. Hence, the normative order is still not installed. By positioning her body, we see here how she's positioning her body, first by moving her body over to the table, and also then later on by walking towards a specific child. And she's also using a gesture, pointing, and she uses all that as an upgrade of her interactional moves. So to summarize, what I wanted to illustrate with that first example is that children in this episode fail to position themselves in accordance with the teacher's directions. Hence, they are held accountable for their bodily non-compliance through a variety of interactional resources by the teacher. Discursive directives and rhetorical questions are used in parallel with embodied positioning and gestures. So I show you another example where, again, we are in a transition between two activities. And you see on the very right of the video, in the very back of the right, a child with a yellow shirt. That is China, and next to that child is Sheila. And those two children have been rebuked before for playing with the pencils. They are not supposed, again, it's a transition between two activities, and the children are supposed to sit on the table and have their arms crossed and to sit still. And those two children keep on playing with the pencils. And the teacher now gets annoyed and walks over to those children. So let's watch that little clip.
That's good. China, Apple and Sana, please stand up. Come and sit here. There is something seriously wrong with both of you. You never listen to what I have to say. China, why? I just told you stop playing with it. What is the problem with it?
Okay. So what we see in this little episode is that the teacher starts by calling the children by name, Sheila and Mila, and I've, for anonymity reasons, I have changed the names in the transcript. Sheila and Mila, please stand up, come and sit here. And she does that while she is walking towards the children and also using a hand gesture indicating to stand up. So while she's addressing them by name, she is producing a directive, please stand up, come and sit here. That implies being positioned as excluded from the group activity. It can be heard as a threat by the children to be excluded from the group activity. So it's likely to be heard as a rebuke or even punishment by the children. And her body movement, walking directly towards the two misbehaving children, can be seen as an upgrade of this directive. It might even potentially be perceived as a threat by the children. While the first part here is formulated as a request, please stand up. The second part is formulated as a demand for action. Come and sit here. And the difference here between requests and demands is that requests allow for acceptance and rejection, while demands assume compliance as well as offer a limited optionality. That means that here what we see is that the teacher positions herself as an authority over the children. Her body movement can be seen as an upgrade of that demand. While the children turn and look at the teacher, they do not provide the preferred embodied answer. They remain seated, they don't get up. This may be seen as a display of resistance on their part and a non-acceptance of that positioning. We see then what follows is that the teacher produces what's called extreme case formulations in line 3 and 4. There is something completely wrong with what you're doing. You never listen to what I have to say. So by doing that, by producing these utterances, she is constructing the children's misbehavior as A, very severe, and B, as not a single time incident, but as a general pattern of inappropriate behavior. So this can be seen to operate to justify her announced punishment. Furthermore, this never listen, by producing this utterance, you never listen to what I have to say. She positions herself also as an authoritative person who has the right to give instructions, and the children having the duty to comply.
Carolyn, I'm just going to interrupt here to let you know you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Then she's placing herself directly in front of Sheila. She has walked over and she's directly standing in front of Sheila, who's still seated in a lower position. She looks at her directly and she produces a summon, Sheila, which can be seen as a request for attention, setting the stage for what follows. Sheila then stands up and looks at the teacher, who then produces a repair in form of a question, why? Now, the why question requires an account. This question can thus be seen as an upgrade of the forced positioning. Sheila, however, doesn't provide any answer, and she remains silent, possibly also out of fear, we don't know, and it's thus the only available position for her to appear as remotely accountable. Interestingly here, the teacher doesn't follow up on her threat to exclude the child from the group or the children from the group, nor does she follow up on Sheila not providing an answer, accepting Sheila's self-positioning as silent as the only accountable positioning available. Instead, the teacher formulates a reminder of the instruction that she had just given to the students in line 9. I just told you to stop playing with it. And she bends down and pushes the pencils away. Using the phrase, I just told you, treats the children's behavior as an intended transgression and non-compliance. Again, she constructs them as knowingly misbehaving and positioning her in that way. So this can be seen, the teacher's endeavor here can be seen as re-establishing order and reaffirming and thereby repositioning her authority as a teacher. Furthermore, by moving the forbidden object away, she displays authority over who is entitled to grant access to the desired object. What is the problem with it? In line 10 is obviously a rhetorical question. She isn't interested in really hearing from the children what the problem is. It implies that there is no reason to disrespect her instruction to stop playing with the pencils. Rather than seeking information, this question is here a case of positioning that is designed to display her emotion, being upset about the already known fact, their transgression. The questions like, what are you doing? What did I say? What is the problem with that? Are not information-seeking questions, but serve to create an environment for the confrontation and the articulation of wrongdoing, inviting the recipient to inspect and account for their conduct. In so doing, the teacher draws attention to the child's problem behavior in such a way as to treat them as intentionally engaging in it and therefore able to account for it. Sheila, almost unnoticed, I don't know whether this was visible in the video, then briefly jumps up and lets her body fall down again, and she makes this creaky sound while she's doing that, which can be heard as a kind of a protest, but it's interesting that this protest is not so much verbally, she's not verbally protesting, but it's a more an embodied protest. So while submitting to the teacher's authoritative force, the way she lets her body fall down demonstrates resistance and protest in a very subtle manner. Similar to vocalized speech acts, the bodily act has an illocutionary force of both accepting the teacher's positioning of her while at the same time expressing her disapproval of this positioning. Now, I have a third example, but I don't think we have the time to do that. So I invite you to read the chapter where I elaborate on the third example. But what I would like to summarize, what I hope I was somewhat able to show with those videos, I mean, this analysis is that practices of positioning in mundane preschool interaction and that I was able to demonstrate how these practices are conducted, how children are positioned, and how we see these normativities of what are normativities that are at stage in this preschool setting, in this specific context. And I hope I was able to shed light on how the children are socialized towards a specific understanding of what they can be held accountable for, in that case, their bodily behavior and what is expected of them, how they are positioned in these interactions. So by these positioning processes that we saw in those videos, children learn what kind of behavior is considered appropriate in this specific sociocultural context, in this preschool setting, and they provide insights into how children's developing understanding of themselves and themselves relating to others, particularly to the teacher as an authority figure, emerge in social interaction. And this study, I hope, also sheds light on the sociocultural acceptable possibilities for resistance. And these examples, and the third example that I didn't have time to show anymore, would also demonstrate that, is that in this sociocultural context, children while they are positioned in a way as having to comply to the authority figure of the teacher and don't have the right to verbally protest against the instructions that they are giving. They have very subtle embodied way to protest and in that way position themselves towards the teacher. So to conclude, what we hope we are able to show with our chapter in the book is that multimodal video analysis and informed by ethnomethodological conversation analysis provides a useful methodological approach to analyze positioning in social interaction. And it also provides a means to add non-linguistic and embodied aspects of positioning in social interaction, so to go beyond verbal positioning. We also hope that we were able to show that how positioning theory can be fruitfully applied to research in early education settings and add to the existing body of literature here, and to link cultural psychology with positioning theory and discursive psychology. So that brings me to the end, and I hope I'm not over time now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Carolin and Bo. Just a reminder to folks as we're changing over to Michael Bamberg, our second presenter, you can put questions in the chat now or throughout. We'll take all of the questions or comments at the end so that we make sure that we get both of our presentations in. So with that, we're going to move on to Michael Bamberg. Michael, you should be able to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Good. Okay, I think I unmuted myself successfully, and the
You
screen
did.
shows.
Your screen is in editing view rather than presenter view. I don't know if you want
I'm still in editing mode. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Play from the start. Here we
There
go.
you go. Okay, good. Thank you.
So we all set. Thank you very much, and thank you, Carolin and Bo, for the powerful demonstration here of how to apply positioning theory and working with some interactional data, and by doing so also unveiling or showing what one could argue actually is going on at a deeper level of what we typically only notice. And I think that's the beauty and the makes positioning theory and positioning analysis, I think, a really valuable resource, among others. So that brings me to the chapter that I wrote. This is chapter 2, and it is entitled possibly not very well, Positioning Narrative and Positioning Theory. But for me, this was an opportunity to do something that I always wanted to do since I was in George Lakoff's class when he and Mark wrote the book Metaphors We Live By. That was that these metaphors are so widespread and typically we don't notice them. And when I nowadays talk about positioning, and do positioning analysis, I also don't reflect anymore that I'm in metaphor fields territory. And so I wanted to use this opportunity to not only unpack the metaphors of positioning and positioning theory, but also then try to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting with other theories that also, and I noticed this more and more, are working with metaphors, but slightly different ones. So that is what this chapter is ultimately about. And I am entering narrative and storytelling from the entry point of positioning theory, and also vice versa. I enter positioning theory. I enter narrative and storytelling from positioning and vice versa. So on the one hand, we position characters in a represented world, in stories, Hansels and Gretels, etc., etc. But then in the telling of and where and how we position these characters as a function of the here and now, how we as tellers, as speakers, position ourselves in regard to our conversational partners, because that's where I think the main chunk is going on, as also Carolin and Bo were showing us, in the relational work that is relevant. And I think this is where then narratives become secondary. They are not at the forefront of the analysis. And all this is happening against background of also what Carolin, you showed with these kind of master discourses or positions that seem to already exist previously, but they are instantiated in situations. So this is where dominant background assumptions, I call these things nowadays, are at work. And this is something now, if we can pull this out and call it up in our analysis, I think we provide some insights that are going deeper than typically in thematic analysis or other qualitative methods. So I also wanted to refer to a chapter, this is chapter 10, that goes deeper into narratives and narrative analysis, where the approach that I am using here as my entry point is basically just a one of many, so to speak. So the other way I'm entering here narrative practices is where the point of doing this is to look at the navigation of where speakers and how speakers actually navigate what in social psychology typically is group relationships or in-group, out-group, sameness, difference. How am I different from other people and how am I same? So these kinds of things that are not fixed are continuously in positioning and in narrative practices then navigated. Similarly, or in the same way, the notion of constancy and change, you know, are we the same or are we different? How have we changed? And then ultimately also the navigation of the two directions of fit, of, you know, is the person or the brand in control here as a doer agentively, or are we controlled by others or circumstances, etc. Like again, the example in the school setting was showing that there is a mutual, but typically with the teacher as the organizer and the one that determines the direction of fit. Good. I just wanted to give a brief example like branding, which is a metaphor, obviously, as we all know, like burning a stamp onto a product. And I'm referring here not just to cattle, but also to humans or chocolates, or ourselves in terms of our national identity or our gender or our age. So I often use the term branding nowadays as synonym with positioning. We make ourselves recognizable, visually recognizable, so to speak. Then we claim a certain kind of ownership or a belonging. Then we show what we value and what is represented in terms of the claims as who we are as chocolates or whatever, and then also how we are different from other chocolates and how we fit into the family of chocolates. Yeah, it's a stupid example, but I think it shows better than if we turn immediately to psychology and talk about selves and identities. But that is all implied in this package, right? And this is also with a function so that others can recognize us and re-recognize in particular, so that something comes to existence here then that we can call they can rely or trust on us as a chocolate or as a German or whatever, and can relate to it. So that's just the example to flesh that out in a little bit more colorful examples. So now to the chapter, to basically the meat of the chapter. What I started out doing is unpacking the transfer from what seems to be a literally spatial realm to the domain of human relations. So the transfer, this is what metaphors do, from a source domain to a target domain. Certain aspects are carried over. And the function, again, is to illuminate something that we typically don't know as well. Again, the best example here is, I think, time. Time is a difficult concept to grasp, and so English, at least, uses a lot of spatial metaphors in 2 hours, like a container, after 5 o'clock. Again, so there are these spatial relationships that are being used that we seemingly have a better understanding of for temporal relationship. Again, just as an example. But here, for positioning, the issue is how do we make sense of human relations? What is happening in interactive situations when people are together? And I also call that the individual or personal, the relational and the social interface, how they typically interact. And I started out always in the past using vessels in open waters as a way of where the source domain is effective, in order to, with arranged coordinates, position, look, this is where I am, and this is where you can find me. But I only recently realized that GPS, the global positioning system, is a much better example. And I didn't know what the P even stood for, that it is positioning here. Because this also enables us with moving objects to calculate time. Time, bring in the temporal dimension into positioning theory and positioning analysis. And I think already to foreshadow, that is something that a lot of the competing metaphors, excuse me, don't seem to be able to capture. So what the dimensions here are, and I listed these 5, the capturing of relationships between objects that are put into a coordinated space, so to speak, now metaphorically, within human relations. Then there is the movement and change between these objects that is captured. And the third dimension is the temporal navigation of this. So moving from one or navigating between certain takes time and positions, excuse me, others differently. And then the forces that are at work in these navigations, and typically being positioned, forces outside, environments, but also others, like dominant people who are in dominant positions, or then positioning oneself. And again, that is something that I think positioning only shares with a number of other competing terminologies, where positioning enables the positioner to be agentive and active and change world, but also being the product of world of others' activities. So let me just, excuse me, there should be a slide here where this is the slide, I mixed them up, where I just listed a couple of those theoretical, where these terms are used within larger theories. But I just tried to check them out in terms of the metaphoric mapping from a source domain to the target domain. And there are chapters in the handbook by Cynthia Gordon on Goffman. If you really want to find out about Goffman, that's where you find more than I am touching on. There's a chapter by Ivanka, I think, Markova on dialogicality, which is also implicated here with voice and dialogue as metaphors, so to speak, again, to illuminate the realm of interpersonal relationships. And then, of course, there's conversation analysis by Pasi, who is here today. So those are chapters to find a deeper and a better understanding than what I try to use here in order to do some comparison and contrast. So to conclude, you know, I went to the final pages of my contribution, and I thought I'd put this up here and just work you briefly through this so that others who will just be able to look at it later also can follow the text line here. Yeah, positioning to me offers, first of all, a framing of entities, and that can be people, singular or plural, individuals or groups, organization, transnational alliance, as intrinsically relational. This frame emphasizes the coordinates between phenomena, excuse me, between phenomena such as and others as gaining their appearance and their position in a, metaphorically speaking, map. Yeah, so where these are ordered in a particular way. And it is their relational positions that calls them into existence and lends them the air of also having an essence, because that's something in other work I'm arguing against, you know, this essential way of attributing all kind of interior aspects to individuals or products or brands, etc. Now, visual and auditory source domains, but also spatial metaphors start from an anchor that is an original point where another entity can be seen, heard, or spatially related to. So that's what I tried to work through with the competing comparative theories. While the I can't see this here because let me put this there. While the latter start from an isolated entity and from a relatively stable here, orienting toward there, positioning in contrast, due to the agency dynamic of being positioned and positioning oneself, gives precedence to a prior relationality over an origin or an ego-centered, self-centered here and there that is the starting point for orientations and perspective. I think that is a really interesting, I mean, that came out to me at least out of my way of working through these other metaphoric concepts. Yeah, that positioning is relational through and through already from the start. So the second fundamental difference is the assumption that entities, and this is not just selves or people, but also institutions or collectives, are in constant movement. They are being, and I use this as another metaphor, navigated, within a system of agreed upon coordinates. And the notion of movement implies a temporal dimension, as I tried to indicate earlier, a navigation between what is the same and what is changing. A ship that is stationary versus a ship, for instance, that is moving, or a car. Again, framing positioning within the dynamics of being positioned and positioning oneself, the passive versus the active agentive, marks entities not only in constant flux, but simultaneously emphasizes the navigation of agency. Yeah. Positions as determined by outside forces, such as the other people or whatever, versus entities as seemingly having agency, typically also in psychology, inside, and putting it to use in what gives them an apparent self-determinacy. Yeah, these are notions, again, that I, in some later work right now, I'm very critical of and try to avoid as much as that is actually possible. While these dynamics and processes that are characteristic for what brings off and holds persons, community, and society together, they are typically at the periphery of most source domains. They have been centered upon in the frameworks of subjectification and, though to a lesser degree, stance-taking. Subjectification, and this is published by Bozanic and his colleagues, understood as a process of self-formation or becoming within the dynamics of subjects experiencing themselves and relating to themselves. And this is also where Foucault comes in. I think we have a chapter in you have a chapter in the handbook with centering on Foucault as well, in concert with Wetherell's conception, of psychodiscursive practices. So these are the 2 or 3 domains that I covered or tried to cover metaphorically, and they are, I think, very close to positioning theory and researching positioning empirically. So I think I'm coming to my last slide here before my thank you slide. Why bother? Yeah, and here again, I would point out 2 important aspects that I find where positioning theory contributes in ways that other theories contribute much less. And that is, first of all, positioning analysis is optimally equipped to investigate formation processes. Yeah, really processes, not just products of what happened, and here is what we can show as a result, but rather the process of identity and meaning-making formation processes. And this is, again, of individuals, collectives, and institutions, where these processes show what is under construction. Yeah, these construction processes are scrutinized microanalytically and moment by moment, as again shown by Carolin and Bo, processes of interaction. How interlocutors navigate, as in shift positions between themselves and others, and in relation to positionings vis-a-vis background or counter assumptions that circulate within communities of interpretation. So that is, I think, a really central part of positioning and positioning analysis. And there we should notice and understand that this kind of analysis does not rely on any recourse to meaning construction processes as springing off from the psychological interiority. Yeah, a mind, a soul, a brain as the engine of actions and then the result in whatever it is that happened. So this is something that I am with positioning theory and using positioning theory in order to oppose traditional psychological theorizing that starts from these internal constructs and considers them to function as engines for action and behavior. Yeah, so just let me clarify one small thing. I'm not saying that there is no interiority, but for analytical purposes, I feel compelled at least to bracket appeals to anything that is happening inside bodies or inside of organizations, because we don't have privileged access to this, but rather what we see is exactly emotions between people, as parts of interactions where they are analyzable, motivations, intentions, yeah, as something that is happening between people, rather than positing them first in the person, and from there moving then into the explanation of what we see. So I think those are the advantages, and this is why my answer to why bother about using positioning theory, but also seeing it in competition, and also to some degree in certain situations as definitely superior to the kinds of metaphorical concepts that I try to work through. So that is basically it. Thank you so much. And I hope we have enough time now still for other things.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, for that presentation. Please feel free to put a question or something you would like the panelists to comment on in the chat. You can also unmute and ask a question, or raise your virtual hand or a real hand if we can see it. We'll try to monitor. We'll try to monitor those, but if nobody's seeing your question, you can unmute and try to get our attention. We do have one question in the chat to start off with, so I'll start with that one, but also be thinking of what else you would like to hear our panelists comment on. So this question is, I think, for Bo and Carolin on it. It asks that, have you considered how the children in multilingual India may be positioned by the dominant use of English? For example, silences caused by English as a medium.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It's indeed a very good question, and I have not looked into that yet, or considered or thought about that. But of course, that is the data I presented is from an English-speaking preschool, and the children are exposed both to Hindi and English language. And at that preschool, they have 3 classes: 3-year-old, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and in the 3- and 4-year-old classes, it's still a mixture, or not so much English. And in the 5-year-old children, everything is done in English. And there's a lot about, of course, this English dominance. And I haven't thought about how that the dominance of the use of English is positioning the children. But that's a very, very important point and a very interesting aspect. So thanks for that.
Does anyone else have a question or comment that they would like to ask?
Mary, could I ask a quick question?
Sure, go ahead, Sydney.
Thank you. First, I wanted to thank everyone, Bo and Carolin. That was fascinating. And same with you, Michael. Thank you. It was wonderful to hear your presentations. Michael, my question is for you. And what I'm wondering is, I was thinking about that last slide that you had about the why bother. And it strikes me that part of what all of you were talking about today is how positioning theory can be a powerful way to kind of sort out the complex social interactions that we engage in, the people we study engage in, and so forth. And Michael, I've had the privilege of listening to other talks you've given, and I've kind of heard and seen you show some concrete examples of using narrative and positioning theory to sort out these complex social interactions. And I was wondering if you could point us as a group to maybe some of your some specific work you've done where you've actually done the how piece of that using narrative. How do you sort out these complex social interactions? And this may or may not be. I heard you talk about GPS, which I think was fascinating with respect to positioning theory, and maybe have you used that positioning theory to help us think about those interactions in your own work that you can point us to. Did that make any sense, Michael?
You always make a lot of sense, Cindy. So briefly, I mean, no, I look, what is happening right now in artificial intelligence. I think this is a territory for positioning and positioning theory in ways that I haven't really thought about. But the interesting part with the GPS, the global positioning, there's an incredible amount of research. If you type in Google positioning, that's what comes up first, before all this kind of social interactional trying to make sense, or even branding. So I haven't checked into this. And if you are interested, let's do it together. Or if anyone else is interested, there would be something there. Yeah. Pointing. All right. Listen, I mean, if I can pick up on your opening the door, I have everything on my website. I don't care about the rights of publishers, etc. If they come, I take it off. But at this point, I have everything that is just coming in new. I have not yet the proofs of the chapter on my website, but ultimately, I hope I can put up the proofs at least. So if people are interested, they can read it there, and they still may want to buy the book. So no worries. So that's my answer, Cindy. Is that basically?
Thank you, Cindy, for that question, and Michael for that response. So Louisa had asked about the details of your publication. So all of these chapters are part of the forthcoming Routledge International Handbook of Positioning Theory. And it is not out yet. As Michael said, we're right now going through the queries and proof stage, but those chapters will be coming out. And some of them, I know that some folks are comfortable sharing their preprint copies with folks that are not fully formatted. I think if you contact authors directly, that's probably the best way to inquire about that. And so, and we will keep providing updates on the handbook as well. So I see there are some other questions that have come through in the chat. This question, I think, is perhaps for everyone, but maybe more so for Bo and Carolin. It says, I would like to ask one question. I think it's challenging for non-native speakers to apply positioning theory and research. I think non-native speakers might not be sensitive to identities and knowing self and some English language. And so the context there may be also working across languages, not necessarily just, I think, in your particular study, Carolin, but maybe in general, as people are in various contexts and working across different languages, this case with English.
Yes, so I definitely agree. Yes, that is a challenge. And here, English is not my native language, but I do speak rather fluently. And at that data that I showed you, the teacher is speaking 95% in English from the data that I see now. Obviously, I only analyze those parts that aren't fully English. And of course, it would be ideal if somebody from the same cultural background would analyze this data, if that is the direction that your question is hinting to. And I've actually published two chapters about comparative qualitative research across cultural communities, or doing research in other cultural contexts, and translation is another topic. If you work with translation, a very sensitive topic. So I would always recommend, the ideal is that somebody from that cultural background would do that research. But I think it is possible to do that research also if you're not a native English speaker. But I see the limitations, and yeah, you do have a point here, absolutely.
Thank you. And there's also some discussion too about like just the terms like native and non-native speakers and things like that, which we won't delve into today, but also reminders about how our language always positions something, right, and evokes these different things, cultural histories, language histories, And sometimes we're limited by those language iterations, which is one of the reasons too why I think part of what we're trying to think about in the handbook, and this is just a very first small step, is thinking across how people, researchers and scholars can use positioning from different disciplines, but also across different countries and cultural contexts as well. And so we want to continue to work to continue to work on that front as well. Another question, which might be interesting to hear all of you comment on your thoughts on this, and this question says, I'm wondering about what the broader actions and implications can we derive or inform from these granular analyses. For instance, how can these findings inform education or policy? And we might expand that a little bit more, to ask the sort of so what question about so what matters? How do these make a difference? What are the broader actions and implications that can be derived? So any of you or all of you who would like to comment on that, feel free.
Can I go ahead, Carolin? Because that is the typical question that comes from, no offense, from people who are used to work with numbers, generally speaking, but from people who are used to want to generalize. In contrast to, I think, something that has been forgotten as part of the ethnographic tradition. If you move into a particular culture, as Carolin pointed out, you've got to, first of all, understand them and yourself and reposition yourself in this process. So I think this is an incredibly important part of then turning to what happens in these micro processes and moment by moment changes that typically are totally irrelevant for my developmental psychologists who are looking at time X and time Y and how people get from, or institutions or whatever, entities get from time 1 to time X. It's irrelevant, but for interventions and also for working with folks, ultimately, I think that type of understanding, I can't imagine how people can do without it and come to intervention programs from these large number generalized projects. That's my couple of cents on this.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. And I very much agree. It's usually the typical question is, so what, coming from specifically people from my colleagues in psychology who are used in this cause and effect models and generalization. I think the so what question also can be answered by in line with what you just said, in getting an understanding of what is happening in social interaction. What are we doing here? And in normal everyday life, things are passing so quickly that we can't see what's happening. And to get a better understanding, what is actually happening here? This kind of analysis can shed light on it. And it could be used also for training teachers, preschool teachers, and show them in the video, see what's happening here. And it could be used also for then training for teachers, for instance. So the one is basically get a general understanding of what you're doing in social interaction, and the second one is to use it in the applied field for training, for instance.
Daniel, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to ask your question or comment?
Hi, yeah, I would like to comment on Mr. Bamberg's presentation, if it's possible. Not commenting the last one. It's okay to go further with another reflection.
Oh, yes, please. Go ahead and comment. Yes.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I'm just started as a doctoral student at the Department of Education at the University of Stockholm. And just a reflection on your presentation that I appreciate that you emphasized the process in positioning theory, because I see it, and I can please respond on this, that it might also solve like the problem that we are in a straightforward way, like controlled by master discourses, by emphasizing the process, can be translated, as I see it, into, what is made available instead of what is available in the interaction, like signaling that the master discourses have no like effect or doesn't like exist outside the interaction. They are like made relevant within the interaction. So my idea is that emphasizing the process is also maybe not solving, but in a way like master discourses are made available within the interaction. They have they are not. I'm repeating myself. They are not just there, but they are made available by the subjects. So as a reflection on that, you're focusing or emphasizing the process. I think that it's, for me, important when I'm trying, because I'm interviewing pupils in Sweden about their reading identities in focus groups and what is made available within those conversations. I think it's important to emphasize that. Because then also the unit of analysis always becomes the interaction, which is important if you go to the discursive turn, as Romharé, for instance, writes about. Yeah, thank you. It's just a reflection.
Thank you. If I can add, I mean, also that makes it possible to develop an eye for what is going on in terms of counter narratives or counter discourses. Yeah, with teachers and pupils, I'm not an expert on that, but in activity groups or there's stuff going on, that is also trying to undermine certain dominant positions. And again, bringing that into the scope of what is going on, I think is where positioning theory is. It's something good that was invented long time ago.
Thank you. I'm also seeing some comments in the chat. Maria Varelis noted some comments about maybe talking with children about what they think ringing means in the classroom, and also noting that in regard to science education, finding some similar things in the chapter. I think that's what you're referring to here, Maria, is that in your review, you found some similar things to what Michael was discussing. I don't know if you want to make a quick comment on either of those observations or...
Maybe I can on the first one. Thank you. That would be a very interesting thing to ask the children about that. What we did in the study is that we showed the video, or my student who did the research, the ethnographic, he stayed there for 3 months. He showed the videos that he took to the teacher and asked her, "What are you doing here? Can you explain to me what you're doing?" And exactly with this incident with a bell, he asked her, "What are you doing there with a bell?" And asked her, explain to me. And first he argued, well, that's a Montessori thing, because they had recently been introduced to Montessori, and that you should do, according to Montessori concept, you should use objects and symbols more than speech. And then at the end she said, in a way, it's just a practical thing to get them quiet. So that helps. But asking the children about, that's a very nice idea. I haven't thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking really connecting with Michael's point about how positioning ourselves and how others positioning us, right? So in some ways, the children may have in a ways of positioning themselves, right? And understanding these in literature and possibly aligning or not with the teacher's understandings. And I wondered even the influence of families, right? And cultural and ways of being in school that have been reinforced by, outside of school norms and understandings of what school is, that comes in some context. So it feels to me very rich in terms of really analyzing from various kind of perspectives. So
I agree. Thank you.
of course. And I'll make connections, I think, with Michael's points. Now I know the chapter when we talked a little bit about what we found as we delve into science education research, and for which some peripherally and others more centrally are using positioning theory, because there's some interesting connections, I think, Michael, and I appreciate really the arguments that you make about agency and temporality and speciality, really, of positioning theory, because in science education research, some of the research have been doing it actually using more sociological and sociocultural approaches and just referring very peripherally to positioning theory, but they're using these constructs in similar ways to what I heard you today pointing out in your chapter.
Thank you for those comments. I want to be sensitive to the time that our presenters have already contributed, and also to folks who are at the end or middle or somewhere along their day. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join in more conversations with our virtual series, and think about joining us at the Positioning Conference at the University of Eastern Finland. I've been to Finland in the winter. It's beautiful then. I'm sure it's also extremely beautiful in the summer. So I look forward to being there. And remember, that call was extended, so you still have time to put in a proposal for the conference. And as Pasi mentioned earlier, the registration should be out around March 15th as well. So thank you so much for all of our presenters today, and for the questions and comments. We really appreciate all the work that everybody has done to bring the handbook together, and the interest in positioning and positioning theory. Thank you.